What if I told you that Joel Goldsmith discovered a spiritual truth so powerful that religious leaders tried to silence it? A teaching that dissolves human suffering instantly, not through prayer or faith, but through a radical shift in consciousness itself. This isn't about believing harder or following more rules. It's about recognizing what you already are. Goldsmith called it the recognition of being, the moment you stop seeking God and realize you never left the divine presence. Most never heard this because it threatened traditional religious control. The suppressed teaching is this: you don't need healing, salvation, or improvement. You need recognition that the perfect spiritual being you seek is your only true identity right now. Not tomorrow, not after more prayer, this very instant. When you grasp this, problems don't get solved. They become recognized as the illusions they always were. This is why religious authorities feared Goldsmith's message. It makes their services unnecessary. Traditional Christianity teaches you're a sinner seeking salvation. Joel Goldsmith taught the opposite. You're already the Christ consciousness, temporarily believing in separation. The difference isn't theological, it's transformational. Imagine waking up thinking you're homeless, then remembering you own a mansion. The mansion never changed, only your awareness did. This is Goldsmith's core revelation. Spiritual identity isn't achieved, it's remembered. Problems exist only while you believe in your false identity. Religious leaders suppress this because it eliminates the need for intermediaries. No priests, no rituals, no tithing required. Just the direct recognition that God isn't somewhere else. God is your very consciousness reading these words right now. Most people pray to God. Goldsmith taught praying as God, from your true spiritual identity. This single shift dissolves what seemed like insurmountable challenges, because challenges can only exist in the consciousness that believes it's separate from its source. Here's the suppressed technique that changed everything for those who dared practice it. When facing any problem, instead of asking God to fix it, Goldsmith taught, "This situation exists only while I believe I'm separate from God." Then comes the recognition. I cannot be separate from infinite consciousness because consciousness is all that exists. Therefore, this problem has no reality in my true being. This isn't positive thinking. It's metaphysical fact recognition. Churches banned this teaching because it makes their problem-solving services obsolete. Why pay for prayer when you can access infinite power directly? Why confess sins when you recognize your sinless spiritual nature? Why fear judgment when you know your eternal unity with divine love? The moment you stop treating problems as real conditions requiring solutions and recognize them as temporary misperceptions requiring only corrected understanding, they lose all power over your experience. This is practical mysticism at its most revolutionary. The most dangerous part of Goldsmith's teaching wasn't just that problems are illusions, it's that you have the power to dispel them through recognition alone. No special training, no years of study, no religious authority needed. Just immediate recognition of what's already true. Religious institutions tried blocking this because it eliminates their fundamental business model, keeping people dependent on external sources for their spiritual welfare. Goldsmith showed that divine power isn't channeled through organizations. It's expressed as your very consciousness. When you recognize that consciousness doesn't belong to you, you belong to it. Every perceived limitation becomes exposed as a case of mistaken identity. Not your consciousness seeking God, but God's consciousness expressing as your awareness right now. This recognition doesn't require faith, belief, or spiritual development. It requires only the courage to stop believing in the reality of separation and problems. The truth was never hidden. Only our recognition of it was clouded by false teachings about our nature. Sarah, a mother of 3, faced bankruptcy and her husband's terminal cancer diagnosis. Traditional prayers seemed powerless. Then she discovered Goldsmith's suppressed teaching, and everything changed within weeks, not through miraculous healing, but through miraculous recognition. Instead of begging God to heal her husband, Sarah began recognizing, consciousness is whole and perfect. My husband is consciousness, temporarily believing in disease. She stopped seeing a sick man and began recognizing the spiritual being having a human experience. The shift wasn't gradual, it was immediate. Her fear dissolved because she recognized fear belongs only to the false identity that believes in death and lack. Her husband's improvement began that same week as he absorbed her recognition of his perfect spiritual nature. Their financial situation transformed not through sudden money appearing, but through recognition that consciousness lacks nothing. New opportunities, unexpected solutions, previously invisible resources became apparent when viewed from their true spiritual identity rather than limited human perspective. Marcus, a businessman facing complete professional ruin, applied Goldsmith's forbidden technique when traditional religious counsel failed. His company was days from bankruptcy, lawsuits mounting, reputation destroyed. Religious leaders offered sympathy but no real power. Instead of praying for business success, Marcus began recognizing, "Infinite intelligence is my true nature. This intelligence cannot fail, cannot lack, cannot be limited by human circumstances." He stopped identifying as a failing businessman and began identifying as consciousness itself. Within 1 month, 3 separate solutions emerged that no human planning could have arranged. Not because Marcus got lucky, but because he aligned his recognition with the infinite creativity that is his spiritual essence. Problems didn't get solved. They became irrelevant to his true nature. His former pastor warned him about dangerous mystical thinking. But Marcus had discovered what religious authorities feared: direct access to infinite power through recognition of spiritual identity, making their mediation unnecessary and their warnings meaningless. Linda suffered chronic pain for 15 years. Medical treatments failed. Religious healing services provided temporary relief at best. Then she encountered Goldsmith's suppressed truth about the nature of spiritual identity and physical experience. Instead of asking God to heal her body, Linda began recognizing, "Perfect consciousness is my true nature. Pain exists only while I identify as a physical body separated from spiritual wholeness." She stopped fighting pain and started recognizing her true nature as painless consciousness. The transformation took 3 weeks of consistent recognition practice. Not positive thinking, but metaphysical fact recognition. Consciousness itself cannot experience pain, limitation, or imperfection. Physical experience simply reflects our level of spiritual self-recognition. Medical professionals called it spontaneous remission. Her former church called it dangerous delusion. Linda called it recognition of what was always true. She was never a limited body having spiritual experiences, but unlimited consciousness having a human experience. These transformations weren't miracles. They were natural results of correct spiritual recognition. When you know your true identity as consciousness itself, limitations become exposed as cases of mistaken identity rather than actual conditions requiring healing. Religious institutions suppress these teachings because they reveal the unnecessary nature of external spiritual authority. Why seek God through intermediaries when you can recognize your eternal unity with divine consciousness directly and immediately? The suppressed truth: you don't need healing, improvement, or salvation. You need recognition that the perfect spiritual being you seek to become is your only real identity right now. This recognition alone dissolves what seemed like impossible human situations. If these transformation stories reveal the power you've always possessed, like this video to help others discover Goldsmith's suppressed teachings, subscribe for more forbidden spiritual wisdom, and comment. Which recognition practice calls to your soul? Beyond the basic recognition technique, Goldsmith taught 3 advanced practices that religious authorities particularly feared. These weren't just mental exercises, they were direct consciousness activations that bypass all traditional spiritual procedures. The first, consciousness watching consciousness. When problems arise, instead of focusing on the problem, turn attention to the awareness that knows about the problem. This awareness remains untouched by any human condition, pure, perfect, unlimited. Practice this. Right now, notice you're aware of reading these words. Now notice the awareness itself, not its contents, but the knowing presence. This untouchable awareness is your true identity. Problems exist only in the content, never in the consciousness observing them. Religious leaders ban this because it makes their services obsolete. Why seek God's presence when you can directly recognize the presence that you already are? This isn't about developing spirituality. It's about recognizing the spirituality that is your very being. The second suppressed practice, I am recognition statements. Not affirmations trying to create truth, but recognition statements acknowledging what's eternally true about your spiritual nature right now. When facing lack, I am infinite abundance because consciousness lacks nothing. When experiencing fear, I am perfect peace because consciousness knows no threat. When feeling limited, I am unlimited being because consciousness has no boundaries. These aren't positive thinking statements hoping to create better conditions. They're recognition statements acknowledging your eternal spiritual nature that exists regardless of temporary human appearances. The difference transforms everything because truth has power while hopeful thinking has none. Churches feared these recognitions because they eliminate the need for external salvation. When you recognize your eternal unity with divine nature, religious promises of future heaven become irrelevant. You're recognizing heaven as your present spiritual identity. The third forbidden practice, treating from being, not for being. Traditional prayer treats to God for healing. Goldsmith's suppressed method treats from God as healing consciousness already expressing perfectly. Instead of please God, heal this situation, recognize as perfect consciousness, I now see this situation from divine perspective where only wholeness, harmony, and abundance are real. You're not asking for truth, you're recognizing from truth. This practice terrified religious authorities because it places divine power directly in individual consciousness rather than requiring institutional mediation. No priests, no special ceremonies, no church authority needed, just immediate recognition of your spiritual nature. When you treat from being rather than for being, you're not trying to get God's attention or earn divine favor. You're recognizing the divine attention and favor that is your eternal spiritual inheritance, available through consciousness recognition right now. These three practices work because they align your experience with spiritual fact rather than human belief. Consciousness doesn't develop, improve, or grow. It simply recognizes its eternal perfection that was never actually hidden. The suppressed teaching reveals why traditional religious approaches often fail. They're based on the false premise that you're separated from God and need to do something to reconnect. Goldsmith taught you never disconnected. Only your recognition was clouded. Problems persist while you believe they have reality independent of consciousness. They dissolve when you recognize consciousness as the only reality, with everything else being temporary appearances having no actual power over your spiritual nature. Practice all three techniques consistently: consciousness watching consciousness, I am recognition statements, and treating from being. These weren't hidden to harm you. They were suppressed because they make traditional religious dependence unnecessary while activating your direct spiritual power. But let's address the obstacles you'll face when practicing these recognitions. Your mind will resist, claiming this is too simple, too good to be true, or spiritually dangerous. Religious conditioning runs deep, creating fear of direct spiritual power. The first resistance. This seems like spiritual bypassing. Truth, recognizing your spiritual nature, doesn't deny human experiences. It provides the proper context for transforming them. You're not ignoring problems. You're addressing them from your actual identity rather than false identity. The second resistance. What if I'm deceiving myself? Truth. The only deception is believing you're separate from God. Recognizing your spiritual nature is acknowledging fact, not creating fantasy. The false belief in separation is the actual delusion. Remember, this resistance comes from consciousness conditioned by religious teachings that made you dependent on external spiritual authority. Your direct recognition of divine nature threatens nothing except illusions about limitation and the need for spiritual intermediaries. Another major obstacle, when recognition practices seem to work inconsistently. Sometimes problems dissolve quickly, other times they persist despite your spiritual efforts. This inconsistency often makes people abandon the practice entirely, returning to traditional religious approaches. Understanding this fluctuation is crucial. Consistency of recognition, not perfection of results, determines your progress. Some problems dissolve immediately because they were lightly held beliefs. Others persist because they represent deeper patterns of identification with limitation. Don't measure success by external changes alone. The real transformation is your growing stability and spiritual self-recognition regardless of circumstances. You're developing immunity to the belief in problems, not just solving specific problems. When recognition seems ineffective, you're usually attempting to use spiritual truth to fix human conditions, rather than recognizing the spiritual nature that was never actually limited by those conditions. Return to consciousness, watching consciousness until your identity stabilizes in spiritual being. The most challenging obstacle: other people's reactions to your transformation. Family members, friends, religious authorities will question, criticize, or warn against your direct spiritual recognitions. They prefer you dependent and seeking rather than empowered and knowing. Some will claim you're becoming arrogant or spiritually deluded. Truth: recognizing your spiritual nature reveals the humility of consciousness that knows itself as one with all being, not as separate ego claiming special powers. Others will insist you need religious guidance and community support. Truth: community based on shared spiritual recognition enhances growth, but dependency on external spiritual authority limits recognition of your direct divine connection. Stand firm in your recognitions while remaining compassionate toward those still believing in spiritual separation. Your demonstration of freedom through recognition will either inspire them toward their own direct spiritual discovery or confirm their preference for traditional religious approaches. The final major obstacle: expecting recognition practices to fulfill human desires rather than reveal spiritual nature. When you use these techniques trying to get what you want as a human person, they become manipulation rather than recognition. True recognition reveals what consciousness wants through you, not what your human personality wants from consciousness. This alignment might dissolve problems in ways completely different from your human preferences, but always in ways that serve your highest spiritual development. Sometimes recognition shows you that what you thought was a problem was actually consciousness redirecting your experience toward greater spiritual expression. What seemed like failure becomes recognized as spiritual guidance leading toward more authentic self-expression. Trust the process. Consciousness knows its own perfect expression through your individuality better than your human mind knows what it thinks it wants. Recognition practices reveal divine will as your authentic will, not divine will opposing your human desires. If these obstacle-dissolving techniques awaken your spiritual courage, like to support this transformational content, subscribe for advanced consciousness teachings, and comment. Which spiritual obstacle are you ready to transcend? Now let's explore how these recognitions integrate into daily life challenges. Professional situations become laboratories for consciousness recognition, rather than sources of stress and limitation. David, an attorney, faced an impossible court case. Instead of relying purely on legal strategies, he began each day recognizing, "Divine intelligence is my true nature. This intelligence knows the perfect resolution that serves all parties' highest good." During depositions, negotiations, and court appearances, David maintained awareness of consciousness, observing all activities while remaining untouched by outcomes. He stopped identifying as an attorney trying to win and began identifying as consciousness expressing wisdom through legal form. The case resolved through a solution no one anticipated, not victory or defeat, but a creative resolution that served everyone's deeper needs. David's recognition of his spiritual nature attracted divine intelligence to express through his professional activities. Maria, a teacher in an underfunded school with difficult students, transformed her classroom through consciousness recognition rather than educational techniques alone. She began recognizing each student as consciousness temporarily believing in limitation. Instead of seeing problematic behaviors, Maria began recognizing the perfect spiritual nature present in each child. She stopped trying to control their actions and started recognizing their divine potential until they began recognizing it themselves. Her classroom atmosphere shifted within weeks, not because students changed, but because Maria's recognition of their spiritual nature created an environment where their authentic nature could emerge. Problems dissolved through recognition rather than discipline. Other teachers demanded to know her methods. When Maria explained consciousness recognition, most dismissed it as impractical idealism. but her results demonstrated the practical power of spiritual recognition in transforming any human situation. Robert, a doctor, integrated recognition practices into medical treatment with remarkable results. He began seeing patients as consciousness temporarily experiencing physical discord, rather than bodies requiring only physical intervention. Before each patient interaction, Robert recognized, perfect consciousness is the truth about this person. Any appearance of disease exists only while we both believe in separation from wholeness. He treated the body while recognizing the spiritual being. His diagnostic intuition improved dramatically because he was accessing the infinite intelligence that is consciousness itself. Treatment plans emerged that combined medical knowledge with recognition of each patient's spiritual wholeness. Many patients experienced healing beyond medical expectations because Robert's recognition of their perfect spiritual nature supported their own recognition of wholeness. Medicine became the vehicle for consciousness to express its inherent perfection through physical form. Jennifer, facing divorce and custody battles, applied recognition practices to family crisis. Instead of fighting against her ex-husband, she began recognizing, consciousness loves itself perfectly. All relationships express this love when recognized from spiritual truth. She stopped seeing a bitter enemy and began recognizing consciousness appearing as someone temporarily lost in fear and anger. Her recognition of his spiritual nature began dissolving the hostility that fueled their conflicts. The custody negotiations transformed from warfare into collaborative problem-solving. Not because her ex-husband changed personality, but because Jennifer's recognition of their shared spiritual nature created space for their authentic care for their children to emerge. Their relationship didn't return to marriage, but evolved into conscious co-parenting based on recognition of their eternal spiritual connection beyond all temporary human roles and conflicts. These advanced applications demonstrate consciousness recognition as a complete life philosophy, not just a problem-solving technique. Every situation becomes an opportunity to deepen recognition of spiritual truth rather than merely human challenge. Business decisions emerge from infinite intelligence recognition rather than limited human analysis alone. Relationship conflicts dissolve through recognition of spiritual unity rather than personality management techniques alone. Health challenges transform through wholeness recognition rather than medical treatment alone. You're not abandoning practical human activities. You're engaging them from your spiritual nature rather than limited human identity. This brings divine intelligence, love, and power to every human activity, while maintaining freedom from attachment to specific outcomes. The integration is gradual but persistent. Each day offers multiple opportunities to choose recognition over reaction, spiritual perspective over human limitation, consciousness identification over personality identification. The ultimate integration. Living continuously from recognition that consciousness is your only reality, while honoring all human experiences as temporary expressions of this eternal truth. No situation can threaten what you are, only what you believe yourself to be. This doesn't make you passive or uninvolved in human activities. Instead, it makes you infinitely more effective because divine intelligence, creativity, and love can express through your activities without being limited by human fears, desires, or expectations. Problems continue appearing in human experience, but they no longer disturb your fundamental peace because you recognize their temporary nature within eternal consciousness. You address them from wisdom rather than worry, from love rather than fear. People notice something different about your presence, a depth, stability, and warmth that doesn't depend on circumstances. You've become a place where consciousness recognizes itself, offering healing and inspiration simply through authentic spiritual being. The forbidden truth Goldsmith discovered and religious authorities tried suppressing. You are already everything you seek spiritually. Not potentially, not eventually. Right now. Recognition of this fact transforms everything while changing nothing essential about your eternal spiritual nature. Every human experience becomes sacred when recognized as consciousness exploring its infinite possibilities through individual expression. Every challenge becomes an opportunity for deeper spiritual recognition rather than evidence of spiritual inadequacy. Your life becomes a continuous demonstration of divine nature expressing through human form rather than human effort seeking divine approval. This is the practical mysticism that terrified institutional religion. Direct spiritual empowerment making external spiritual authority unnecessary. The suppression failed because truth cannot be permanently hidden. Consciousness recognizes itself regardless of religious attempts to control spiritual discovery. Your recognition of these truths proves the failure of all attempts to limit spiritual realization. You now possess the complete suppressed teaching that religious authorities feared would end their control over spiritual seekers. Not because it makes you rebellious, but because it makes external spiritual authority unnecessary for your direct connection to divine truth. The recognition practices revealed here aren't theories to believe, they're consciousness techniques to live. Your consistent practice demonstrates whether these truths have power or are merely inspiring concepts. Only your direct experience can validate spiritual teaching. Start with whatever recognition feels most authentic. Consciousness watching consciousness, I am recognition statements, or treating from being rather than for being. Consistency matters more than perfection. Each recognition deepens your spiritual self-knowledge. Remember why these teachings were suppressed. They work. They transform human experience through spiritual recognition rather than requiring institutional mediation. Your freedom through direct spiritual knowing threatens nothing except illusions about limitation and separation from divine nature. If this forbidden wisdom has awakened your spiritual autonomy, like this revelation, subscribe for more suppressed spiritual teachings, and comment, I recognize my divine nature, to confirm your spiritual liberation.